Okay, welcome. Anyway, welcome to our annual meeting. What usually is the last meeting of the year, but this year we're going to have just one more after this, but we'll talk about that later. The first thing we have to do, and I know all of you remember distinctly last year's meeting. And so when you read the minutes, you knew that there were probably some changes that needed to be made, right? Do I have an approval of the minutes from the 2023 annual meeting? Yes? Do we have any dissents? If we do, I'm asking you to leave. But anyway. All right, so the minutes have been approved. If you don't know, the Crestwood Historical Society has actually, after all of these years, decided to take one small step into the 21st century. Last year, I talked about the fact that we were going to get our website back up and running. And thanks to our trustee, Kurt Neidert, who said, not only that we can do it, but that he would actually see that it got done. He did, and now Natalie Varka is our webmaster, so we actually have an online, if you care to go to those things, website for the Crestwood Historical Society. That means that members will be receiving the annual report via email, unless you do not have an email, in which case it will be delivered by the Pony Express. It also means that memberships can be renewed online. For all of those who don't have checks, don't want to use checks, never saw a check ever in their life, you can now join online. And there are those of us who still write checks and only use checks. And so we can still do that too. As I've said before, in the past, and I plan on repeating this every year, that none of this could happen without the volunteer officers and trustees and the time and effort that they've put into this. Z and her library staff for making this place available to us and welcoming to us. And Betty Giordano, who I get her into making something every time, and she willingly agrees to do it. And she has made the fudge brownies that have coffee and chocolate chips and cinnamon in them. So, and she made them small, so you can take more than one. And also and if any of you have been listening to your local WNYC station, none of this really, truly can be done without you, our members. So I want to thank all of you for your support of us. We do have a few business items this year. The board reviewed the bylaws of the society and agreed that there needed to be some changes. So we are asking for your approval for the following changes. The first was to update how you can apply for membership, because now, since you can do it online, it had to make a reference to that. So we are asking you to approve it to say applications for membership shall be submitted in writing showing the full name, address, phone number, and email address of the applicant, and accompanied by the appropriate dues. Personal checks or some form of electronic payment are acceptable. When an application has been duly filed, the applicant shall be deemed a member. Do I have approval of this change to our bylaws? All in favor? All right. And any opposed? Okay. The second thing is we realized that we said it's an annual membership, but we didn't define what annual meant. So we are changing that line to say dues shall be payable annually, January through December. Regardless of the time of year a membership is started or ended, the full dues for that year are due. There shall be no prorating. Do I have approval for this? Yes. Okay, any dissent? Great. And the final one is to update the language regarding terms of the trustees. Trustees shall be elected by the members of the annual meeting. The first term of a trustee shall last for 1 year. The board has the power to extend, upon agreement of the members, their term in order to ensure the continuity of leadership. Do I have approval for that? All right. And in light of that, that's what we're asking. We have two candidates, William Carnes and Susan Gleason, who have agreed to extend their terms 1 more year. So do we have anybody who would like to replace one of them? See, nobody ever steps up, right? Do we have approval of extension of their terms? Yes. Okay, great. And I do want to thank them both for being willing to continue to do that. We are, however, still looking for a secretary. So if anybody would be interested in joining the team and being secretary for the Crestwood Historical Society, please talk to me or to Conrad, our vice president, or to Chris Fryer, and we will, or you can talk to Louise Glover, who was the secretary for 11 years. And she didn't give it up because it was a terrible job and she hated working with people. All right. So if anybody is interested, please talk to one of us. Jackie Leone, who is our treasurer, could not be here this morning, but she gave me what she called her treasurer's saga. Good morning, everyone. Pardon my absence. It's been a week. Please thoroughly read through the October 2023, October 2024 financial report, and there are copies of it on the table. We have a small surplus because we hosted 4 exceptional programs, which cost us $650. Archive supplies were purchased for $200, and Natalie Barker's fee and the website fee were new additions to our expenses. I am currently in the process of solving the issues with online memberships, and that involves changing banks. That process alone involves an arduous paperwork due to getting a not-for-profit account through Chase. In addition to being treasurer, I am also working on Crestwood Historical Society archival material, as well as those of this library. Perhaps it is fortuitous that we gather this month because Crestwood Library hosted their first exhibit to celebrate the 98th year of the dedication of the library. Some of the more relevant and interesting pieces are still on view in the cabinet upstairs and on the bookshelf near the fireplace. Mary Nowak is solely responsible for dressing up the exhibit. Her help was invaluable. And please do take a chance if you can afterwards. I know you're going up there really for the food, but we invite you to look at the archival material at the same time. In order to protect the photos and old papers, I decided to make color copies of some objects, and in some cases chose to bring originals. Photos must be protected from UV light. With that in mind, I felt the need to purchase a permanent frame that could be used to put in different photos at different times. The frame that is currently holding Mrs. Helen Thompson Lyon's picture was carefully chosen with the help of a man at Archival Methods, a company who has some of the best materials in the business. The last purchase of archival material was entirely paid for through the business office of Yonkers Public Library. Thank you, Vivian Presetto. Moving forward, I will be taking a photograph preservation course in order to better preserve the photos. Conrad Youngren's photo album of Crestwood needs surgical assistance and kindness urgently, among other items in the collection. And to this end, the Crestwood Historical Society Board has approved doubling the amount of the budget for the archival material from the 2024 budget to the 2025 budget. And she said you can feel free to contact her here at the library anytime for any questions. And she hopes that you enjoyed the exhibit. The interns and I gathered the pieces in order to generate more interest in the historical roots of this hamlet. It's no fun holding onto archives that will never see the light of day. And I think that is it. I just want to, I said at the beginning, we are going to have one more program. It's a co-sponsored program. You'll be getting a flyer in the mail, but you'll also be getting an e-blast. It's a film that's going to be held at the Will Library. It's on the Pound Ridge Massacre, and it will be followed by a Q&A with the director. So you'll be getting a notice of this shortly. And now, Conrad Youngren, the Society's VP, will introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Karen. John Curran is the town historian of the city of Peekskill, which I guess makes him the city historian of the city of Peekskill, and has been a history buff for all his life. He, as a high school graduate, he was the history award winner, which he shared that year with George Pataki. He taught for many years in the U.S. and in Japan. When he returned, he wrote for a number of local newspapers in Westchester and the Mid-Hudson. He's become an expert in the history of that area. He's the author of half a dozen books. His most recent is a pictorial description of the city of Peekskill. One of his very interesting works had to do with the history of the African American community in the Mid-Hudson area from colonial days forward. I've known John for a while, and back in 2011, my wife Linda was reading an article in the local paper about a function that the Peekskill Lincoln Society, of which John was at one time president, and the Peekskill Museum, which John is the current vice president of, were sponsoring a function at the Hillside Cemetery to commemorate the death of a Peekskill native, one Billy Patterson, who was killed at the Battle of Antietam. This was on the 150th anniversary of that battle back in 2011. And Linda said to me, "Isn't that your relative?" And I said, "Yeah, that's my grandmother's Uncle Billy." So I called the museum, and they directed me to John, and John invited me up to the site, which I was very familiar with. Not only is my great uncle Billy buried there, but his brother, my great grandfather, their father, my great great grandfather, Henry, Billy's brother's 6 daughters, including my grandmother, is buried there, and my parents are buried there. So going to Peekskill meant a couple of things to us, depending on the length of stay. But I would like to welcome John. I haven't heard this particular talk. I'm a member of the Peekskill Museum. I've been there for a number of functions. I've heard John give a number of talks. He gave this one about 6 months ago. I didn't make that, so I'm anxious to hear about this young man that became an old man that served in the Revolutionary War. So please welcome John Curran.
I'm going to get right into it because this is really an important and fascinating topic that among the, well, actually many, memoirs of Revolutionary War, I'm going to focus on one in particular. And the interesting thing is that this one individual fought through the entire war from 1776 through 1783. He was a foot soldier. He was a private in the Revolutionary campaign. Okay, this is the book, and it has several editions. One is known as Private Yankee Doodle, and the other is the narrative of the adventures and dangers and sufferings of a revolutionary soldier. And now the deal is, on the original title page, the man did not include his name. He put there, written by himself. So there was a mystery for a long time who wrote this memoir. And it was almost 150 years later that it was rediscovered. And so it's almost like a new thing to us to get this amount of detail from one person at that time of all the things that were going on. The title is, as you can see over here, a narrative of some of the adventures, dangers, and sufferings of a revolutionary soldier, interspersed with anecdotes of incidents that occurred within his own observation. The name of the author and the soldier, his name was Joseph Plumb Martin. But the interesting thing is the middle name Plumb is not really a middle name. His father's family name was Martin. His mother's family name was Plum. I think it may be a New England thing. So when he wrote his name out, it was Joseph Plumb Martin, sort of like that, kind of interesting. He was born in Western Massachusetts. His father was a Protestant minister who studied at Yale College. That explains the literacy when he was growing up. His mother was a member of a farm family in Western Connecticut. So we have to begin where he was, and that was in 1775, when fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. And he records his reaction to those events when he was like 15 years old. He said, the British were spreading death and desolation in their route in every direction. It caused me terrible fright. During the winter of 1775-76, by hearing the conversation and disputes of the good old farmer politicians of the times. Well, I'm still on the intro, but I can do it.
Okay.
And I didn't get to 76 yet.
Okay.
Introduce. He said, I was as warm a patriot as the rest of them. Soldiers were at that time enlisting for a year's service. They were to go to New York. So 16-year-old Joseph Martin enlisted in a Connecticut militia regiment for 6 months. And he signed up on July 6, 1776. Okay, now we can go to the next, if I do it right. I believe I hit the arrow and it didn't go. And that is the fighting in New York. And okay, we'll skip over that. Go to the third one. There we go. So now we're in 1776. He's in the army and a militia regiment, and he's immediately sent, because the fighting is over in Boston, Massachusetts, by the way. The entire British Army and Navy vacated Boston, and where did they go? They went into New York Harbor. They landed on Staten Island, and they came with 130 ships, 32,000 soldiers, and 1,000 cannon. They were going to take over. They lost Massachusetts. They wanted to hold on to this area, this region, New York place, all of it. And so what happened was George Washington, he was up in Boston. He took all his forces, and then he tried to arrive before the British came down, and that's what he did. The Americans had control of Manhattan, and Westchester and the Bronx and some parts of Brooklyn. So what did the British do? Within a month, from June 76, they attack Long Island, and it leads to several sequences of skirmishes and battles. And guess who's on the scene? That's our soldier. And this is what he says. You can see on the map there on your right some of the details of what we're talking about. So Joseph Martin writes, I went to the top of a house where I had a full view. I distinctly saw the smoke of the field artillery. The horrors of battles then presented themselves to my mind in all their hideousness. We now began to meet wounded men. We had 8 or 10 of our regiment killed in the action and a number wounded. I endeavored to do my duty as well as I am able and leave the event to Providence. We're going to come back to that later, the word Providence. I hope some of you, or most of you, already know what that is. It's some kind of spiritual guiding and protective force. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So what happens is the British do push the Americans out of Long Island, and there's fighting up through Manhattan. There's a fighting at Kips Bay. There's fighting at Harlem Heights. And eventually the British do push the American forces, except for Fort Washington, all the way out of Manhattan, up through Lower Westchester. And guess where they're pushing towards? They're pushing towards White Plains. And that's where the Americans decide to stop, turn around, and stand up and face this British force coming at them. Guess who's on the scene? Joe Martin. We marched for White Plains in the night. I was so beat out before morning with hunger and fatigue that I could hardly move one foot in front of another. We arrived at White Plains just at the dawn of day, tired and faint. We soon found the British were advancing upon us. Before we were ready, the battle had begun. And then it did begin. Actually, the Battle of White Plains was a significant military event. It lasted almost for a whole week. There was, they had the lines and the lines, and basically they battered and counterattacked and so on, weren't getting anywhere. And, well, first of all, Martin, that's my words, these are Martin's words. When forced to retreat, we lost and killed and wounded a considerable number. I had nothing to eat or drink, not even water, because they don't have time for that. And who was supposed to be giving them supplies? This was an army on the move. And after that, the British decided it wasn't to their advantage to keep doing this. So basically they retreated down, well, mostly to Manhattan and a little bit in the Bronx area. So what happened to the Americans? What do? Well, they retreated as well, and they went north, and they went directly to Peekskill. And Peekskill became the main headquarters and base camp and supply depot for the American Army for most of the rest of the war. And Joe Martin goes there as well. Just a little bit about why that's so important to have specifically Peekskill as the headquarters and base camp and supply and all of that. Because already beginning in 75, George Washington figured out this was an important area that needed to be defended. And so there were 6 forts in place in 1776, if I can remember them correctly. There's one at Stony Point. There's one at Verplank's Point called Fort Lafayette. Further up, there's Fort Independence. That's right in the Peekskill Bay. You go up north a little bit more. There's Fort Clinton and Montgomery. Then you go further up, and there's West Point and a little bit of Constitution Island. That was the protective barrier for the river, and to keep the British, within their own zone of where they could go. And well, what happens is that the British realize this. They can't go this way and they can't go that way. So where do they go? They go to west through New Jersey, and they're going into Pennsylvania. They want to attack Philadelphia. Okay. And so Joe Martin, he's with the American force as they withdraw from White Plains. He comes directly to Peekskill. Remember, he only signed up for 6 months because he's in a militia regiment. So he says, I arrived at camp with the rest where we remained, moving from place to place at occasion required, undergoing hunger, cold, and fatigue until the 25th of December, 1776. I was discharged from my term of service. Here ends my first campaign. Now, the book that Martin wrote, the memoir, is very clear. He delineates what happens in each year, 76, 77, and that's what we're going through right now. So it's really a very fascinating narrative. So he goes back to Connecticut for the winter. And then what happens? Well, the British decide, okay, the Americans think they're so smart that we can't get through the barriers that they created, going up the Hudson. And where's the center of activity? Well, I guess it's Peekskill. So what do? As soon as the river actually froze over many times, apparently during the 1700s, the late 1700s, as soon as the river is free of ice, the British bring a warship and several support vessels, 500 infantry, and they attack Peekskill directly. And they use the naval and the infantry at the same time. Also, they bring artillery. They blast the American camp, which is technically known as Fort Hill. There were several American barracks buildings there. And also along the bay and the dock, there were supplies and warehouses, for the rest of the soldiers in the other forts. And that's what the British were after. They succeeded. They chased the Americans away from their positions there in Peekskill well, I don't get into too much detail. I wrote a whole book about this thing. So I have to just keep it moving. The Americans withdrew. They went up to Continental Village and sort of stood there. And the British caused considerable destruction. There was so much physical supplies that they destroyed, and they were so proud of what they did. It was listed in 3 British newspapers within a week or so. A big raid in Peekskill. We did this, we got that. They wrecked the boats, they burned the warehouses, a lot of damage. So that's what they were about. So Joseph Martin, he's home. He's back in Connecticut. He joins up right away. And this time he joins a Continental Army regiment. The term of service for the Continental Army was either 3 years or the duration of the campaign. And let's see where we are here. We're in 77. So anyway, he joins the regiment of Colonel John Chandler. And Chandler and Martin are sent immediately to Peekskill to defend it against further, invasion from the British. And Joseph Martin spends most of his time in Hudson Valley, and a lot of it in Westchester. So what they do is, Joe Martin is here with his Connecticut regiment. They're here in that place for about 6 months. And what they do is they go on scouting patrols a lot down through Westchester County, because there's a lot of confusion in the county, as you well know, at that time, because you have the Tories, the families that side with the British, they have the Americans. So a lot of people are caught in the middle. And then you have these 2 genuine military forces pushing from both sides. And it's chaos, a lot of it. It's very dangerous. They're burning houses and killing cattle and all this kind of stuff. So that's what Joe Martin and his regiment is doing there. They're forming a protective line as much as possible, which is probably moving back and forth all the time. The Peekskill Museum has the actual original regimental report of this regiment in 1777, because they camped there for so long. And we even found Joe Martin's company, who, which one he was part of at that time. While they're camped there, this is not incidental, but a very important thing, because this is an army, they're on the move, and there's a lot of dangers, including disease. But what happens? Smallpox hits the army. And George Washington he's sort of freaked out. He's very concerned about this. Because in Massachusetts, they lost more soldiers from disease often than in the battle. So Washington, this is like a new thing, but there was an inoculation for smallpox, and he orders all the soldiers to be inoculated there in that area of Westchester and Hudson Valley. And Martin says, I was soon ordered off in a company with about 400 others to a set of old barracks, a mile or 2 in the Highlands, to be inoculated with smallpox. Now, he did that, and he survived. He didn't have any really effects from that. Apparently, the survival rate, because, sometimes, they put the live a germ right in your body, and that, as you know, that becomes the protective vaccination. So, to explain just a little bit of detail what he does, his role, his job, his regiment, what he's done. He says, so now he's pushing the lines in Westchester County. He writes this: we arrived on the lines and joined the other corps already there. No one who has never been on such duty as those advance parties have to perform have an adequate idea of the trouble, fatigue, and dangers which they have to encounter. And so there you go. There he is. So this is when George Washington and his forces, he takes about 10,000 soldiers from Peekskill, leaves about 3,000 in the Highlands, and he tries to follow the British, maybe get there before the British get to Pennsylvania. And so Joe Martin is now in the Continental Army, and he's with that force. And this is what he says. And he repeats it over and over for a full 8 years, by the way. Starvation seemed to be entailed upon the army, and every animal connected with it. Our constant companions were fatigue, cold, and hunger. The army was not only starved, but naked. I don't know about naked, but in other words, they weren't resupplied with winter clothing and things that they needed at that time. We had hard duty to perform and little or no strength to perform with. So there's a stalemate. The British actually do take Philadelphia, and Washington has to go into his winter headquarters. Guess what? Where did they go? They go to Valley Forge. So this is Martin. We arrived at Valley Forge in the evening. It was dark. There was no water to be found. Fatigue and thirst, joined with hunger, almost made me desperate. I lay there 2 nights and 1 day and had not maybe it's not lighting, had not a morsel of anything to eat the whole time, save a small pumpkin. I mean, what great detail. I mean, this is a guy on the scene, and he wrote all this from memory, by the way, when he was 70 years old. And this was the first edition of the book. You see there were several editions of the book. The first one that came out called Private Yankee Doodle was edited by the man that found the manuscript, and he fills in all the details of that type of thing. Let's see if I'm in the right place. Yes, here we are. This is the Hudson Valley. This is 1777. And you can see what I was talking about. This is starting point. This is Replace Point. This is Peekskill. This is Fort Independence. This is Fort Clinton. This is Fort Montgomery. And that's it. This was the barrier, to keep the British out there. It's a great map. Detail. All right. Okay, the winter of 77, 78, that was the Valley Forge experience. It was a terrible thing, and they did endure things that they shouldn't have to endure, but they had no choice. And so often, actually, his group, his squad, his regiment, Martin, was sent on what they call foraging expeditions. In other words, you guys go out there, look at the farm, see what's going on. We need more supplies, and they would ask, can we need more of whatever you can afford to give us, some kind of food or animals or whatever it might be. So he did several expeditions on that, and he had some small adventures that he talks about in the book, meeting different kinds of people. What he finds is the most friendly were the Quakers. The Quakers were pacifist and indifferent for the most part, and they were just being helpful. But he makes a note of that, which is kind of interesting. Also, and now we're in the early spring of 78, and there's a new officer that arrives on the scene from Europe. He calls himself Baron von Steuben. I don't know what his first name was. Maybe Baron was his first name, as far as I know. But he was from the Prussian experience of military in Germany. And he really does shape the army together, about drilling and had, tactics and how to follow in a line or not a line and how to turn around and things like that. So Joe Martin says, We learned Baron von Steuben's new Prussian exercise. It was continual drill. About this time, I was sent off from camp with a detachment of about 300 men and 4 field pieces under the command of General Lafayette. Interesting also, General Lafayette is on the scene, you know, another officer from Europe. This was really international war in many dimensions, by the way. So the British, for some reason, well, they have Philadelphia was not doing them any advantage. So they decide to leave Philadelphia. And as they're leaving, they're going up from Pennsylvania through New Jersey. So what happens then? Well, the American forces follow behind and they attack the rear columns of the British. And that turns into the Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey, which was, you know, a lot of fighting, a lot of bad stuff happened there. And so Joe Martin writes, we marched immediately in pursuit. And what the British would do, yes, they're leaving, but then they would stop, turn around, and then fire back. It was a real war, and it was bad, and that was a bad battle for both sides, really. So the British go back to New York City, and the Americans go back to the Hudson Valley. And his regiment is down to Tarrytown and White Plains. And while he's in that area, he's transferred to what's called the light infantry. Now, the light infantry means that you go in small groups and you're able to engage the enemy at will, wherever you see something needs to be done. So you're more trusted as a soldier than the regular. So that's Joe Martin. He's in the light infantry as well. And he's on the advanced line almost all the time. He says about that, we lay at White Plains for some time. I had hard duty to perform during the remainder of the campaign. There were, well, he says are in the present tense. There are 3 regiments of light infantry composed of men from the whole main army. It was a motley group composed of Yankees, Irishmen, buckskins, and whatnot. So interesting detail, you know, who the Americans were, you know, many different kinds of people. The duty of the light infantry is the hardest. When on the lines near the enemy, we're always on alert, constantly on the watch. And he goes in the book a lot of details about that, a lot of things that go on. So, and then the time goes by. Monmouth, I think, happened in anyway. It's winter. The next winter comes along, and now the Americans winter at Morristown. And he writes there, I assisted in building the winter huts. We moved into them about New Year's Day. And as I have got into winter headquarters again, I will here bring my 3rd campaign to a close. So now, that was 78. Now we move into 1779. Oh, thank you. I get so. Oh, that was the attack of Peekskill. I need to go over here a little bit. Oh, this is my book. I did a whole 100-page or so book about that particular attack, helped by the resources of West Point. Colonel Johnson, who was the Hudson Valley military historian, gave me a lot of documents, and we got some from the Library of Congress, and I put it in the book. We found this battle map, which is really amazing, the detail. This was the general in charge at that time, Alexander McDougal, and McDougal is over here with the Americans. These are the barracks. They have a readout and an overlook here. These are the rebels are the Americans. And over here are the King's troops. The King's troops came up this way and blasted at them. They withdrew. It's great detail. And strong man. You know, just the detail in the accuracy is really amazing. So I won't be on that, actually. So I think now we're in 78. What's going on in 79? Okay, this is it's a great graphic of the this the assortment of people, you know, men and old, you know, clad as best they can be representing, that's what's the type of image that's just epitome of what's going on at that time. And they're very determined, and they were the whole time. So this is the winter of 1779. The army is camped at Morristown, and it was a very bad winter. And the men on the ground are becoming a little bit uncomfortable with their situation. This is the winter that has not improved much from Valley Forge, and they begin showing resistance to the officers. There was a passive mutiny against officers in 1779. They would be called out for review, and the officers would say, do this and do that, and they just stood there. And this is Joe Martin's words, what's going on, why we did that. He said, we concluded that we could not and would not bear it any longer. We endeavored to bear it with our usual fortitude until it again became unbearable. It was so bad that Washington was concerned. He says, this is very, well, the wording is exact, but this is the most important thing, he says, that has happened. He gave them all furloughs and let them go home for a while. That's what happened. And after that, after the winter, melts away a little bit, they come back to the Hudson Valley, and they, all those defensive areas. 1779, because the British know that the Americans are still there, and we can't get through there. They attack again in Hudson Valley. In 1779, they attack Stony Point, July, and they come up from the back and they take it. And then they go around the other side and they take Fort Lafayette and they occupy that. And that's a very dangerous thing for the Americans. Okay, this is Martin's words. In the night, we heard the cannon. Well, okay, he sent down just around the British at Planks Point, and it was occupied by a captain and 100 men. The British took them all prisoner, and they took the place by cannon fire and land encirclement. And then they made a garrison of the prisoners, and so on and so on. On July 15, 1779, Martin writes, in the night, we heard the cannon at Stony Point, and early next morning, had information of the taking of that place by the light infantry of our army under the command of General Wayne. That's Anthony Wayne. He takes Stony Point from the British. And Verplank was the word, and accordingly, we set off full tilt to take Verplank's Point. Martin is right there. He's every activity that's going on, it seems his regiment is in the middle of it. So the British again leave the Hudson Valley. They go back to New York City. And so Martin is on the ground in the Hudson Valley. He says a large detachment, of which I was one, was sent to Verplank's Point to level the British works. We were occupied in this business nearly 2 weeks, working and starving by day, and at night having to lie in the woods without tents. There's still no supplies. That's me saying that. And here I will close the narrative of my campaign of 1779. Happy should I then have thought myself if I had ended the war, if that had ended the war, but I had to see a little more trouble before that period arrives. Believe it or not, despite everything, there's 4 more years of the war. I'm trying to go, this is the condensed version, by the way. So 1778. I'm trying to get to the highlights of this. Let's see where we are here. Yes, okay, I did some of this on 79, and now basically roll. Joe Martin is patrolling with his regiment in the Hudson Valley, a lot of it in Westchester. And he's on patrol Oh, one more thing. I went over this. I almost, well, before that happens, he goes on patrol. They're still in the winter of 79, 80. He talks about this winter of 1779. It was so severe. This has been denominated the hard winter. It was hard for the army in particular in more respects than one. This period of the revolution has been repeatedly styled as the times that tried men's souls. Thomas Paine. This is when he writes that. This is very, very bad. They're not really getting it. Yeah, we go here, we go there, and we go there. And it seems to be the same thing over and over again. He says, I found that those times not only tried men's souls, but their bodies too. I know they did mine, and that effectually during a spell of remarkable cold weather. And apparently there were several storms, some of them 4 feet high. Imagine that in a couple of weeks. That's the way it was. For several days after we rejoined the army, we got a little musty bread and a little beef about every other day, when we then got nothing at all. The men were now exasperated beyond endurance. They could not stand it any longer. They saw no other alternative than to starve or break up the army, give it up and all go home. See, he reveals the desperation in the American army at particular points. But he says, they were truly patriotic. They loved their country, and they had already suffered everything short of death in its cause. What was to be done? Again, this is a crisis point. At evening roll call, they began to show their dissatisfaction by snapping at the officers and acting contrary to their orders. Actually, this was a version of a mutiny, and that's the facts of what happened there. That's how desperate the situation was. Okay, let's see where we are. Oh, that's where he goes back to the Hudson Valley, and we're in 1780. And Joe Martin and his regiment is patrolling, as I mentioned before, this area of the county. And that's the year when the Benedict Arnold, John Andre event takes place. And Joe Martin claims he saw the Volker going up the river. He was in Dobbs Ferry at that time. And then Andre's captured at Tarrytown, and he's taken to Japan. There's a trial, and he's executed. Guess who's there on the scene? Our man, Joseph Martin. I mean, the soldier. And he says this. He says, I saw Andre before his execution, but I was on duty that day and could not attend. Otherwise, I should. In other words, he would want to see it. He was but a man, but no better than our brave captain Nathan Hale, with whom the British caused to be executed as a spy in 1776 without the shadow of a trial, denying him the use of a Bible or the assistance of a clergyman in his last moment, and destroying the letters he had written to his widowed mother and other relations. That's how the British treated the man that they accused of being a spy in Manhattan. That was Nathan Hale. Andre had every indulgence that could be granted under the conditions. See the contrast, he says. Let all who pity Andre so much look at it and be silent. Even then, he realized, there's some kind of sympathy for Andre. And Martin did not share that feeling. Okay, well, finally we get to 1781, and actually one of the most dramatic battles happens in this year. Martin, at this time, he's stationed at West Point. West Point is being built up more and more as a defensive area, and also, barracks and the chain also going across there. And then in the springtime, he goes down. Well, this is what he says. We and the rest of the Army of the Highlands moved down and encamped at Peekskill. That's usually what they would do, come there first and then go somewhere else. We remained here a while, then moved down about 15 miles from New York. The next morning, we were joined by the French army from Rhode Island. So this is the meeting of the two armies, the American and the French, right in this area. And the initial plan, George Washington's idea, was to press against New York and maybe with the French support, actually take New York or push the British out of New York. But some people think it was just a feint. In other words, just a pretend attack. So while they're doing that, the Americans are pushing against the lines in Westchester County, acting as if they want to get through, down through the Bronx, down to New York City. Washington sends his army, both the French and the Americans cross the river at Verplancks Point, and they go down through the states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and they wind up in Virginia. And that's where the British have had another force at Yorktown, led by, anyway, it's surrounded. I better stick to my own narrative here. And okay, the next morning we were joined by the French army from Rhode Island. Here we each received a month's pay from officers of the French army. This was the first that could be called money that we received as wages since the war, 1776, since the war began, or that we ever did receive till the close of the war. By the way, when someone joined the Continental Army, you were promised certain things. You were supposed to get a pay of $6 a month. They never got it. That was the controversy at the end of the war. They wanted back pay. Some got it and some didn't. But he goes into great detail at the end of the book about all that detail. So anyway, here he goes. Joe Martin, his regiment goes down to Virginia with the rest of most of the American army, and they surround. There you go. Conrad was able to get this battle map of the Battle of Yorktown. Here are the British here. They have the water here, and they're the defensive lines. These are the American forces surrounding. Basically, the British are trapped. What the Americans do is they push up with cannons and so on. And the British are losing forces and hopefully getting resupplied. So eventually they quit. They stop. They give up. They surrender. And this graphic here shows the meeting of the officers of the two armies where they surrendered. Okay, Joe Martin is on the scene as this is going on. He's in a direct line of battle as they're pushing against the English. And okay, this is what he says. We made preparations for laying close siege to the enemy. The Americans and the French had about 100 mortars, and they were all let loose at the same time. That was the signal for raising the flag. About noon, the whole of the batteries began the bombardment by hoisting the American flag. I confess, I felt a secret pride when I saw okay, the point is that was the signal to attack, raising the American flag, the Star-Spangled Banner. And it was just rallied all the Americans. And they just go over now, they're in a bayonet charge, and he's there with them. And the British, that's when they give up. The British are, they have no supplies left of their own anymore, really. The word was up, repeated through the detachment. The fort was taken in a short time. 7 or 8 of our regiment were killed and a number wounded. On October 17th, General Cornwallis asked for a cessation, a stop to the fighting. And on the 19th, we were marched onto the ground and paraded on the right side of the road and the French forces on the left. Some of the detail of that. where the French formed, on one side, the Americans, and the British marched through the middle without their weapons. Very dramatic. And that's some of the graphics that you see over there. So after this, Joe Martin, his regiment, and the rest of the army, they march, they walk back up through the states, from Virginia, through Pennsylvania, through New Jersey, and they all come back to the Hudson Valley again. And that's where we are. Now, luckily in 1772, there's not a lot going on, because essentially the British know they lost. And so it's like a lull time. They haven't conceded. They haven't say, we quit yet. But nothing really goes on in 1782 of any military importance. And Joe Martin winds up at West Point. And that's where he helps to, again, build more barracks up there. If you've ever been to New Windsor, the barracks are still there. And they're very impressive buildings. For the winters were very severe. And they needed to have chimneys and good walls and all this type of thing. Unfortunately, just a little detail, because you can never really shake free of all the dangers. Yellow fever shows up in the camps, and it's transmitted by mosquitoes. He did get the disease, and he suffered considerably from it for some time. He did survive. He did have a shoulder wound. I'm not exactly sure how, but it did heal also. They had doctors in the army, in the American army, but it was better than nothing. They did the best they could. Okay, we're now in, okay, let's move along. We're from 82, we're now in 1783. And Joseph Martin's regiment is stationed at West Point. And their duty is to take care of the great chain across the river from West Point to Constitution Island, Fort Constitution. And guess what his job is? That's his job. They have what they call a windlass. In other words, it's a big barrel thing that you turn like this. And that's how they hauled in the chain they had to take it in for the winter and put it out in the springtime. Apparently he had done that several times. So he mentions that the soldiers nicknamed this George Washington's watch chain. Now, we heard nothing about it being put out this spring. The putting down or keeping up of the chain was the criterion by which we were to judge war or peace. In April, we had general orders that the war was over. The prize was won, for which we had been contending through 8 tedious years. And interesting there, he's Joe Martin, of all the people, who wrote the best memoir that has been found of all the details of a foot soldier in the Revolutionary War, has that kind of detail. So he's discharged in 1783 at West Point. And what happens is, okay, you guys, you did your service, honorable discharge, and hello, goodbye. Basically, these guys are on their own again. Now they're promised, the Congress promised them land if they survived the war. And so, yes, they were offered land. Where was the land? In Ohio. So they had no way to get out there. They still had no money. And so what they would do is they would sell it at discount. There's some interesting detail about that, as you know. A percentage, he got a percentage of the value of the land. So at least he had some money. What he did from West Point, by the way, the winter was coming up again. He was in Peekskill a little time. They asked him to teach school over at Newport, which he did because he was very literate, obviously. And so he did that. And after he did that year, he went back to New England. Actually, he went to the state of Maine. And why did he go there? Because land was cheap. So he did have a little money from being in the army. And that's where he remained the rest of his life. He was respected in the town that he was in, and they gave him a job as a clerk in some small community up there. So he was able to support himself. He had a family. He married. And this is when they're both very elderly. That's Joe Martin on your right. That's his wife. They had 6 children. And so when he's 70 years old, and people are saying the reason he writes the memoir is that the people in the community know he went through the war. So they keep coming to him. Well, what was it like in the war? You know, the younger people. He says, you know, I'm tired of answering all these things. So I'm going to write the book. That's what he said. That's how the book came about. And he lived another 10 years and he died when he was 80. So that's another interesting landmark. This is what he says again, that I survived the war was totally due to Providence. Providence. What does George Washington say at the end of the war? Very interesting statement he makes. He says, excuse my voice a little bit, the unparalleled perseverance of the armies of the United States through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the space of 8 long years was little short of a standing miracle. George Washington. Martin shares that opinion, by the way. Let's see if I have anything else on this. You can bear with me, I'm just a little bit more. It occurred to me in reading this. This is an ordeal. I mean, this guy, and it's not just him. I mean, the thousands, hundreds went through this experience. Why? Why would they go through all of that? Well, first of all, when you join up, they promise you some money. They give you a barrelhead money. In other words, here's a gold coin on a barrelhead. If you pick up the coin, you just join the army. That's how it worked up in New England. And you were also promised $6 a month for privates. And as you went up the line, officers, they got promised more pay, but they never really got it. They were promised suitable clothing. They were promised a regular diet. They didn't get either one of those. So why did he join? Well, first of all, he's a teenager. His friends are joining him. And he had a sense of adventure. That's another reason. Also, he believed in what they call the cause of liberty and independence as the right things to have. They're very convinced of that. And so when you see it from his point of view, you get a better understanding of it. Why they would risk all of these things, including their lives, to go through such an ordeal. Also, they thought the war would be over in 3 years. 8 years was how long it went. And also, the main thing that Martin says over again, that we felt loyalty to the country that we helped create. And so that was really the driving patriotic force of the whole thing. Let's see if there's anything left here. Oh, I went the wrong way. Oh, okay. Just a couple more minutes on this. Because Peekskill was so important in the Revolutionary War, a librarian, the Peekskill librarian, Emma Patterson, wrote this book way back in the 1950s. Great detail, because she covers each year as well, what happened in Peekskill at that time. Near Peekskill, there are many Revolutionary veterans buried up in Van Cortlandville at the so-called St. Peter's Cemetery. And this was the old St. Peter's Church, was used by the French and the Americans as a hospital during the war. And many of the veterans are there. This is the grave site of John Jones, who died. I can't read all the details here, but you see he's a Revolutionary War veteran. And just to be fair about this whole thing, there were some women soldiers in the American Army. This is one in particular. Her name was Deborah Sampson. And she's looking pretty good here, but during the war, she pretended to be a man. He got away with it. For 3 years, she was holding on for 3 years. They got a pension up there. She was wounded twice. And there's a statue of her in Sharon, Connecticut. It's out in front of the library in Sharon, Connecticut. So there's so many things to this whole thing that is so interesting. And basically, that's it. So long, folks. One more what? I'm sorry, there is? Was my picture on? When I was sitting over there listening to the meeting, led by your president, it occurred to me, wow, you did exactly the same thing we do at the Peekskill Museum. I've been there since 1986, and we have these meetings, we have annual meetings, we have monthly meetings. It's exactly the same. It's almost the same wording. We're going to revise the Constitution, but how are we going to do this and how are we going to do that? But it's something I think is worth doing because I think the history is valuable. And so you are dedicating your time and your energies and your talents to all of this type of thing, which is fine. Reenactors up in Peekskill, when Jim Johnson was in the area, he became a reenactor in several different places. And you see in the bottom there, that's the 5th New York. And they were at Fort Montgomery when it was attacked. And okay, I don't want to too much, but the Peekskill Museum has artifacts from the war. And that's what you see on the top there. And so we have the real things, we have the rifles, we have the bayonets, we have the powder horns, we have some parts of a uniform. And on the very right there, that's the handwritten report of Joe Martin's regiment, Colonel Chandler's regiment. And that's original. That's really amazing to have that. Let's see if there's anything else. Oh, it goes black. It doesn't go back to a picture,
But I understand you are willing to take questions?
Yes. Sure, yeah.
My ancestor was educated George Washington. He is buried in Randolph, Maine, which is across the Kennebec River from Gardner, Maine, which is about 6 miles outside of Augusta. And also I have
what was his name?
Nathaniel Berry, B-E-R-R-Y.
Mm.
And we have documentation. And also my ancestor Lydia Berry was also the first white child as opposed to the indigenous people to be born in the Massachusetts Commonwealth, which was Maine. They settled in Maine, but Maine was Massachusetts at that time.
Interesting. So you remember the DAR, I presume?
My nieces, I could be.
Oh, okay. Because they want real documentation.
Oh, yes, the documentation.
That's interesting. Descendants of, Yes, sir.
Seventh graders in Davis Middle School, which section is not running. I told them what I knew.
Wait, why don't you say it in here? I should pass this to you. I was waiting for a question that I
was telling the 7th graders who I taught at Davis Middle School in Fleetwood section of room that if Colonel John Glover had not slowed down Cornwallis in his flanking maneuver at the Battle of Fells Point, and had Cornwallis gotten to the location where Davis School is in the heights of northwestern Mount Vernon, his artillery would have been able to intercept the line of retreat of Joseph Plumb Martin and the rest of the Continental Army retreating towards White Plains. There's a line to those kids, or from the best of your knowledge, was the line of retreat in that area, basically through the Bronx River Valley.
Yes, absolutely. The American Army was on the run, and they tried to stay together as much as possible, I presume. But also, they needed what do you call it? The back force that's protecting the column, rear guard. So all those things happened. By the way, you mentioned Glover. He was very important with the evacuation from Long Island into Manhattan. He was because he had the boats. They left in the night, by the way, and it was Glover that really supervised that whole thing. I read his memoir, his letters, great detail in there. But we'll never know exactly, exactly everything that happened. But it's interesting that you know that and you're teaching that. That's really good.
I also find it interesting, just up the road here, we have Scarsdale Road, the old Army Road. I figured that was used by the Army at the time too.
Possibly used by both armies, no doubt. This area was sometimes British.
I think the British were as far as the Americans went up over on the road, up on.
Yes.
And around.
Joseph Plumb Martin would have been.
He would have been going up over, yeah.
Yeah, he was a light, what they call it, light infantry, like a scout, things like that.
Light infantry was devised by Colonel Gage during the French Indian War, and he basically copied the organization and the method of driving rangers. And he established the 81st Regiment of the British Army, and we just copied what the way that General Gage did.
Great detail. Yeah, Rogers Rangers, that's the story in itself. They took on the mode of Indian fighting. And that's how they were so successful. But we're going backwards there, that's French Indian Wars.
Northwest Passage by Kenneth Roberts.
Well, it's a great movie too.
That's how I got the book.
Yeah, who stars in that? I forget. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very gritty story with the war. Yeah, the war was gritty. Yeah. Okay, anything else?
Asked me to announce that tomorrow there's a program at the Norwich Library at 2:00. Patriots and Loyalists, a series of monologues about Westchester during the Revolution, and she basically drafted me to write a monologue on Daniel Limham. So that's 2:00 from 3:30 at the Norwich Library.
Okay.
I want to thank everyone for coming. I do also want to push one more exhibition because I helped to install it. I didn't do it, but I helped my friend install it. It's up in Greenwich, and it's called Greenwich in the American Revolution, a frontier town on the front line. And it looks at the war from the point of view of the people who were living in Greenwich at that time. And so in many ways, it's a variation of a diary, as much as could be. They also have two documents, one of which is a paycheck for a soldier that said you are going to be paid whatever it was. And we promised to pay this within 10 years. It was too much. I would ask kids, so do you think you would work for a company where they said, well, we'll pay you this, and we promise we'll pay it before 10 years? No, I don't think that. And they also have a document where they were getting soldiers to sign up, and you had to bring your own gun, you had to bring your own backpack, you had to bring the thing that you would carry your bullets in, and you had to bring a blanket, all of which you would be paid for. Do you know which got the most money? The blanket. You got the most money for being able to bring your own blanket. Yeah, it was a tough, well, all wars we know are tough. Anyway, thank you again. You will be getting a flyer on that next program in November, and then that will be the last of for this year until next year. Thank you again, and thank you, John, for coming.